Thank you so much, Victoria. I encourage all of you to read the paper, the full version, as soon as it's online, because there's much more inside the paper that could be told in 12 minutes. Of course, it's very frustrating. The paper provides, I will comment more on some dimensions of the presentations, but also something that was in your paper, because I think you have important rich data and some counterintuitive information and conclusions. You have surprising numbers. I really was stricken by some of them. I allow myself to quote just a sentence in your conclusion. Today, approximately 1/3 of the parishes of the whole Moscow Patriarchate are located in Ukraine, which means that the future of the Russian Orthodox Church will be decided to a large extent in Ukraine, which makes this topic extremely important. And the paper provides also, and this is what was apparent in your presentation, a counterintuitive information on the level of control from Moscow on the Moscow Patriarchate Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which appears to be limited, institutionally limited in many ways. And this is really, unbuilding this automatic parallel between Moscow and the Moscow Patriarchate Orthodox Church is extremely important. I would like you to comment on a few dimensions. The first, I would like to think with you on the difference between soft power and level of influence that is present in the text, but I think we have two different dimensions here. You define soft power as the ability to attract others, drawing them into in your culture and values so that they share in your worldview, wish to follow your leadership. But in your paper you have two dimensions, one which is not soft power and one which is soft power. The one which is not soft power is the influence of institutional Orthodox Church from Moscow on, the influence on the institutional level. And this is hard power. I mean, this is we are not talking about the cultural influence, but of the direct control on Moscow institution, on a local institution. And on the other hand, we have the influence of this church discourse on the local level on parishioners, which is soft power. So is there a way, my question would be, to assess this second dimension and to measure the efficiency of a pro-Ukrainian or a pro-Russian position of a parish on parishioners and beyond that on the society? Do you think, how can we measure the success of this soft power strategy? We'll do it in a discussion mode. So
Okay.
doesn't work. Try again.
Okay. Yeah. The level of control. I think I highlighted that on the institutional level there is that certain freedom. It seems, but that doesn't mean to say that individual clerics are not engaged directly with Moscow. I think that that's something that's very under-researched. I can't give specific information about that, but let's think generally about why people might be motivated to reproduce that narrative. Because I think to some extent it is a spontaneous reproduction of what's seen as common sense truth to many of these clerics under this Moscow steering wheel. In some respects, I think there's a powerful intergenerational aspect there. Many of those clerics tend to be older than those of the Kiev side. They grew up, they were socialized during the period of the Soviet Union, and their kind of truths have been formed in that tradition. Ukrainian Orthodox Church as the exile directly under Moscow. So that's what's accustomed for them. Of course, people will talk about specific kind of hard economic incentives, benefactors, motivating clerics to behave, to speak in that way. And I think that's something, again, I don't have any research on that, and that would require very different methodologies. It's possible. That we're talking about human beings here, but I think, well, yeah, that would be a kind of, to talk about dissimulation of people is a very different thing. Also the appeal of the canonicity, the Third Rome narratives, these are the kind of things that I think motivate people. Yeah. So in terms of measuring the success of this pro-Russian influence, this is actually something I hope to do later on in the postdoc. To my view, a country can have a very strong narrative, very coherent, let's say. It can have many outlets disseminating that view in society, but soft power, that consent, which is what I think is really interesting about soft power, that spontaneous consent, independent of the kind of carrots and sticks. We only know if that's present if we ask the audience. How do they negotiate those narratives? When I was doing the PhD, I conducted some small-scale audience reception research to see how, actually I just looked at students, but to see how they responded to Russian soft power narratives. There was a survey, and then we followed up the findings with focus groups. So that's how I would suggest to measure.
Would you have information on the strategy of the Russian Orthodox Church in other post-Soviet countries as compared to this in Ukraine? We were talking about interfront with regimes. Are there a religious interfront inside the Orthodox institution in Moscow?
That's a really interesting question. It is something that I hope to explore in greater depth, because the postdoc will have a comparative aspect with Kazakhstan and Estonia.
Okay.
But what's quite interesting about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church is that level of institutional autonomy. That's something that the Estonian and the Kazakh churches don't have. So it would
to be continued, right? I would like you please to go back to this slide that you didn't have a chance to show, because this is just, I learned it was a surprise for me to notice that. Could you please comment on this and the number of churches by region?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I mean, the point to show here was that this church is well established across the entirety of Ukraine. It's not something that's kind of a pro-Russian. It's weaker in the south and the east of Ukraine. Of course, we can see in Galician region it's significantly weaker, but besides that, in the Volyn, in central Ukraine, there are many parishes. Of course, however, this is 2004 data. This is the most recent that was available. And I think we can probably say that this balance will have shifted. There's been a massive campaign of church construction in eastern areas of Ukraine.
So in my opinion, what we see here is first that the Moscow Patriarchate Orthodox Church is less present in eastern and southern Ukraine, which does it kind of decrease its power of influence on the population? I don't know. I'm not sure, but it's still interesting, and that it has a huger influence that I was expecting in central and western part of the country. So this was part of what was striking really in the data you provide. I don't know if is it a question of level of religiosity in general in Ukraine?
I certainly, yeah. This is on the east. It's more the legacy of atheism, of course. There is the phenomenon, like I said, there's been massive church construction in eastern Ukraine, but parallel to that, as was suggested by the statistics, there's rumors of these ghost churches where they've constructed a building, but they haven't really attracted a congregation to that. Maybe because of the legacy of atheism, that people are less inclined to think in those terms.
At the same time, you have a lot of new religious group evangelists arriving there, right? So
yeah,
in the eastern regions more than in the rest of Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw in that yellow portion, it was there's many. There's hundreds, at least in between 100 to 200 and different small groups.
My last question would be more on the armed conflict. The religious dimension and the Orthodox narrative was really present on one side, on the pro-Russian side of this armed conflict, where we had self-proclaimed religious battalions, such as the Russian Orthodox Army, etc. And religious groups have been targets of violence from such battalions, which claim that there was a religious dimension of this war, and the Orthodox world was fighting the others. Is there a reaction? What is the reaction of the Moscow Patriarchate and the Russian Orthodox Church based in Russia? Is there an official reaction to this kind of battalions? Do they accept this?
I must admit, I'm not aware of that. I think there's, a tendency maybe not to comment on it. The church has said, there's no cause for religion is no grounds for violence in any case, and that kind of narrative, that neutrality narrative, I suppose, has been quite important. But yeah, I think it's...
So officially it's not behind, the church is not behind this religious way of fighting, the religion war.
But at the same time, that idea of fighting for the Russian world, I think probably Patriarch Kirill is quite a diplomatic person. I'm pretty sure that he would avoid commenting on those issues. But that doesn't mean to say that it doesn't go on through different channels. There has been a strong spiritual element, at least in theory. Right? We saw in those films the kind of level of disillusionment that people have felt with ideas and values.
And also the presence of priests everywhere, right?
Yeah.
On both sides of the armed conflict, actually.
Yeah.
Let's open it up to discussion. Oh my God, already. Okay, please.
Thank you. As I skipped the last session question, I will have three, but very short, because some just clarification of what you showed. How you were evaluating the transferring from the Moscow to the Kyiv Patriarchy? Because I haven't seen Odessa, for example, at all at your map as moving, but I know it personally how many people I saw suddenly this April in the Kyiv Patriarchate Church. And people were exactly, like, it was a huge amount of people, and the only phrase was all the time in the room that we've never go to the Moscow Patriarch anymore. So, like, because it is visible, and here I haven't seen, I'm interested in your methodology. The second question is, were you evaluating the priests who were members of the local councils? Because it was quite a huge movement for many years in Ukraine that a lot of priests of the Moscow Patriarchy was very active in the local political life as members of the local councils, and by these they were both intervening in the internal political discourse, but also in prevention of other churches, for example, to receive land to build their churches. So it was for the south and for the east extremely, I can speak about Odessa region when I know exactly that there were too many scandals because of the political involvement of the local priest. And the last but not the least, were you comparing it, like you said about Kazakhstan and Estonia? It's a little bit different situation, but for example with Georgia and Serbia, where Moscow Patriarchy, because of their connections with the local Patriarchy, were seriously influencing the political discourse on such issues as the gay rights, as human rights, as the European Union integration. Like in Georgia and Serbia, the biggest anti-European integration Orthodox Church. The same in Ukraine, the biggest talks and demonstrations. So it was not only inside of the church, but there were marches along the streets with the icons against the European integration of the states. So were you comparing it? Thank you.
Okay, so in terms of the transfer of parishes and parishioners, yeah, it's actually quite difficult to really get firm numbers on people who've transferred from one church to another. That's because sometimes I think a sense of affiliation is actually different from actually practicing one's religion in a building of a given church. So whether that the transfer is physical, they walk to a different church to practice, or are they just declarative? They say, I give up on that church and I embrace this other one. There's not data on that actually. In many cases, there isn't there's a transfer of parishioners and parishes. Many times there's no need to transfer the parish to a different church authority because they just walk with their feet. It's only the transfer of parishes tends to occur in those places, rural places, where there's only one church, and that's when that struggle occurs. And that's what was shown on that map. That's based on information gathered by the Religious Information Service of Ukraine, and it's not actually just since the Maidan, it's also before the recent Maidan, though most of it was in 2015, I think. Yeah, the issue of priests on local councils, yeah, that's again, I think that's something that's really under-researched, that more direct involvement of priests in local life. I mean, I think that's actually one of the, perhaps one of the attractions for priests of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine as compared with in Russia. I think in Russia they wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. It's something that I would be on shaky ground to pass too much comment on, but I think it's a really interesting and important issue that should surely be researched further. And in terms of anti-EU immigration manifestations, yeah, I think a lot of that has been undertaken by organizations of political orthodoxy, which Metropolitan Volodymyr has sort of tried to keep slightly distant from, but yeah, it's definitely taken place, and in the paper it talks a little bit about that actually. Yeah, those kind of slogans that were used to disparage the Maidan more generally by pro-Russian people.
Okay, dear colleagues, please ask one question. Okay, not Elena, please.
Victoria, I have one question about the financial situation of Moscow Patriarchate Church. How do they generate their budget? Does the Russian state support them? Do they have some additional sources? Are they transparent in terms of their budget? Can you say a few words about it?
That's a really good question, and I don't think it's one that I can answer satisfactorily. I mean, they've got financial autonomy, and when I spoke to people in Ukraine, they actually said that one of the main attractions of the Ukrainian Church for the Moscow Patriarchate is the fact of so many parishes, like 1/3, like we said, being in Ukraine. They're actually, it's a big piggy bank, a big money box for the Russian church. So they talk about the transfers to Moscow. Of course, there are significant landowners in both countries, which gives that certain basis.
Thank you. So I'm also really taken by this chart, and I wanted to put on my epidemiologist hat for a second and say that this is so interesting in terms of reach and prevalence, but it's hard to kind of pull out some of the, I think, social questions that you were getting at, Anna, without a couple things. One being the case definition, which is, are these churches, are these empty buildings, you know, like what are we looking at? And then what's the denominator? Every public health researcher was like, where is the denominator? So it's 574 in Zakarpattia out of how many population, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like what's being represented, things like that. So mostly my question is methodological. Instead of asking you to sort of like prognosticate about all these regional variations, I'm curious to know if there are paper tigers out there, right? If there's numbers on a page that don't actually represent this soft power that you discussed being enacted successfully, how would we see them? And how might we find them?
Sorry, I didn't think I quite caught the last bit of that question.
Oh, so if if some of this is just air, like the ghost churches you were talking about, or if something can look really nice for the patriarchate on paper, but you yourself as the researcher have not been able to physically walk there and see this is a building, there are people in it, there are things happening, is there a way to perceive that, to identify that from a distance?
I think it's very difficult to do that. Yeah, and that's one of the key issues. Deep field work would surely be required. But I suppose one of the ways that I've sort of circumvented that in my research is looking at the outputs. How actually do people, regardless of what's on paper, regardless of what they actually do, what's the impression that people actually get of their work? And people surely held up this idea of ghost churches as a kind of a scandal, as a controversy, as in their I could just skip. Yeah, this is really interesting. When I found this cartoon, I was quite fascinated because all the different elements that are represented in it, I think it's fairly recent actually, but they actually were expressed in the focus groups that I carried out in 2011. The idea of kind of being a vehicle for the Russian world, yeah, the strong influence of money. This kind of, is this a money bag here? It's got this sort of Soviet emblem on here. This kind of security.
The watch.
The watch, of course, the watch. That came up in my focus groups very prominently. So it was really interesting to have those findings embodied visually kind of after the fact anyway.
Anthony, please.
I don't know how to formulate this into a question. I've been trying to think, but it's. I'm just intrigued by the idea that what the direction of Ukrainian nationalism and the future of Ukraine and the role of the church, because whether it's for Ruski Mir or for sort of autocephaly, it's still Orthodox, right? It's still anti-inclusive values, European values like LGBT rights. I mean, both Kirill and the other metropolitans, I can't remember. They're all on the same page with regards to gay rights. Yeah, I mean, they don't like it. And if they were to compromise on that, they would cease to be Orthodox, right? They would be, something else, not the early creed of the church. So I'm just wondering really where you think it goes from here. Are we going to see a sort of an unlikely alliance, perhaps, of the Moscow Patriarch and the Kiev Patriarch when they realise that actually the direction of Ukraine might not be heading towards where either of them want it to go? So I just sort of wanted to sort of ask you, how does it look, on that side, from that point of view? Am I making myself clear? Not really.
There's certainly a very particular political context to what's going on, and it's true that though doctrinally these churches have only recently become separated. It's very much, I do mention this in the paper. It's the sort of political aspects to them. It's very prominent, and I guess the case is where the Moscow Church goes from here actually, because regardless of, there's the behavior and statements of certain clerics within that church, and then there's also the way that those very same behaviors are cast in the media. What's foregrounded, what's sidelined. This is quite a political question. Interestingly, when I did my research, I found that the people that were mostly aware of the Ruski Mir, it was those in Western Ukraine actually. They had this kind of negative image discussed in the media, I would suggest, whereas those in Eastern Ukraine, presumably, perhaps the first line in the audience for that, had a very vague idea indeed. They perhaps hadn't heard of it.
So my question is, the people in the West do they support in some sense the ideas of Ruski Mir, that it isn't European values, it's nice Orthodox values that they also share with their Moscow brethren?
Well, this concept of the Ruski Mir, it's a very diverse concept. Its definition is very diffuse depending on who you talk to. For some people, it's a kind of the Russian equivalent of the Francophonie, and obviously for others, it's a much more imperial idea. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Could you articulate again that question?
They're singing from the same hymnal in a way, sort of anti-gay.
When I was doing, Joseph Nye, he talks about three aspects of soft power: culture, values, and foreign policy. And when I asked people in Lviv, Kiev, Kharkiv, Donetsk about culture and foreign policy, what they thought about Russia in these elements, there was a really clear divide between those towards the west, those towards the east. This was really clear. But when I asked about the social values, the kind of the key points in which sort of attitudes towards gay rights was included. Though actually the differences between the regions was not statistically significant. So we can talk about a common value, shared value sense, but that's not the same as support for the Ruski Mir idea, because there's much more to it than that. But
Yeah, I'm sorry, dear colleagues. We unfortunately only have 45 minutes, so I'd like to take as much questions as possible. We had a question in the middle. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
My name is Alexandra Harulu. Thank you for this forum and thank you for a very interesting presentation. I have a two-part question. If the current exit from the Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine continues, will it not be challenging that patriarchy's aim and platform of being the largest Orthodox church in the world, and what are they going to do about that? And at the same time, the same church has a representative on the board of the All-Ukrainian Organization of Churches and Religious Organizations, which is a very strong supporter of pluralism. One example is a year ago they sent representatives to Rome for the International Council of Christians and Jews, which is a global forum, which unanimously accepted Ukraine's membership. I imagine that that's not a very popular thing with Moscow. Can you comment on that, please?
Yes, certainly it's the, I think that from the Moscow perspective, like the issue of Ukrainian autocephaly is seen through the prism of losing Ukraine again, and it's a existential issue. I think actually, when I went to Moscow, I spoke to people. They wanted to bring Ukraine back. Some people I spoke to, but they didn't mean territorially. It was more civilizational, ideological, cultural. They wanted Ukraine in their civilization a little bit. It's difficult to. I think this year, has caused doubts for anyone who tries to predict the future, but certainly I think the Moscow Church will try to resist Ukrainian autocephaly strongly. But what that means, like you say, for the local church itself, I think it's a profound difficulty. Yeah. I'm not sure I can answer it more clearly.
I'll collect 3 questions. The young lady, Natalia, and Victoria, and your question. Okay, I'll collect 4. Please.
Thank you. Very incredibly interesting talk, and actually building on what we were just talking about. So obviously, the Moscow Patriarchy needs a new strategy if it is to keep expanding, and given the politicization of religion in Ukraine. And I know in Russia, the Patriarchy has been very, very active in using technology, encouraging different priests to develop blogs and mandating that they have to gather a certain number of followers in a certain period. So I was wondering if technology has played a role in the Patriarchy used as a tool to gain new members and to kind of fight this ideological battle in Ukraine. Either if it's something they've done already, or if it's a tool perhaps they might use in the past.
Okay, can you give the mic to Natalia, please?
Thank you, Victoria. Your paper was of great interest to me. I'm originally from Puchayev, and there is definitely a lot of tension and contention around the Puchayev Latva. And in your paper, you mentioned in passing about the Bill 4128 and the legal challenges around the change of affiliation. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, and what is the status of the bill, who is behind the draft of that bill, and also what is the controversy around it? Thank you.
Do you see a danger from the one side, we have growing stereotypization of Moscovian Patriarchate churches as it depicted in your cartoon, and from the other side, if you look at where parishes and believers are located here. They are located in west and central Ukraine, so they might be also stereotyped or othered just because of the fact of belonging to a wrong church. And if I look at my data, for example, for me it was a big surprise that over 50% of Moscow Patriarchate believers supported monuments for ATO or Heavenly Hundred, but we don't have this picture in the media. We only have this type of cartoons there.
Thank you, Victoria. So in 2014, there was a presidential election as well as a parliamentary election in Ukraine. Have you observed any implication of the church leadership or religious parishioners in agitating for any of the sides? I'm asking you because in 2010, when there was a rigged election, when Yanukovych won, there was a clear implication of the Moscow Patriarchate in favor of Yanukovych. Thank you.
And now the challenge for you is to answer these questions in 2 minutes.
Okay, technology as a tool for the Moscow Patriarchate. Yeah, certainly I recognise that it's clear that they have to establish blogs and the web presence is supposed to increase. You can tell that because they look rather similar and some of them aren't actually that well populated after a certain period of time. But I think they tend to also use more traditional means like festivals, like kind of rock star priests. That's something, a way of reaching out to people that they've used. I think it's more engaging personally, and also the Orthodox Initiative grant competition, a kind of networked way of co-opting people in different countries, canonical regions of Ukraine. The bill, the controversy of the bill, this bill aims to legalize or make easier the transfer of parishes between different church communities. It's seen as very controversial from the Moscow side. They consider that it's going to be legalizing raiding, what they consider raiding. For others, this is simply a means of reducing the tremendous legal administrative burden in cases where there's clear will among the parishioners in a small village or small settlement to move from one to the other. So yeah, it's very controversial from the Russian side. So the stereotypes of the Moscow Patriarchate parishioners. That's a really tricky question to answer, I think. I mean, the data that I presented, I'm not sure we can take that even in 2004 as necessarily being kind of correlating with the number of parishioners. Okay, yeah, that would be fantastic. The election involvement. Yeah, after the elections when they were seen to be so prominently involved, I think they've tried to very much keep certainly a more low-profile picture. Yeah.
But it was still present, right? In terms of materials, handout materials in church, which might have shown certain candidates as they did in 2010. I mean, it's my presumption. No way how they operate.
Yeah, they've certainly tried to keep back from that.
Over their Christians.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry we have to stop there. It was a very rich discussion. Thank you very much.